Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. It is Tuesday, April 8th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with diplomatic reporter Laser Berman in Washington. Hi, Laser.
Hi, Jessica.
It's day 550 of the war. This morning, crowds gathered outside Israel's Supreme Court ahead of the High Court hearing that's set to begin regarding petitions against the government's controversial decision to fire Shin Bet Chief Ronen Bar. Those petitions and talks are expected to continue for several hours. There are also the headlines that U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff will lead talks with Iran on its nuclear program. That will be in Oman on Saturday. And we'll talk to Laser about those talks, as well as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's back-to-back trips to Hungary last week, and then a split-second decision to fly to the U.S. to meet with U.S. President Donald Trump. The trip to Hungary appeared to go very well for the Prime Minister. The U.S. trip, perhaps not as much. Stay with us. So, Laser, tell us what you've been hearing and seeing since you landed in D.C. following that trip back and forth to Hungary. Are there protests against the Prime Minister outside the White House? What are people saying?
Well, first of all, I should stress that I did not fly from Hungary to D.C. with Netanyahu on his Wing of Zion plane. I had returned from the Hungary trip on Friday, and then on Saturday night discovered that I need to be heading to Washington, D.C. because Netanyahu was going there last minute. But since I finally arrived in D.C., it's been pretty quiet. There's been some protests outside of the White House, but very, very small, maybe a dozen, maybe a little bit more. People that say they're anti-Zionist Jews, who knows? There were some Neturei Karta there as well, those Hasidim who protest against Israel, but otherwise really very quiet and wasn't shut down the way the city was when Netanyahu was here last time.
And what can you tell us about Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's trip to Hungary? How did it go? What happened there? And why did he tack on this U.S. trip right after going to Hungary?
Now, the trip to Hungary was kind of an easy trip for Netanyahu. He knew what he was going to get out of it. He was going to get Hungary backing out of the International Criminal Court, which was a huge win for Netanyahu. He was also able to walk around in an EU country, a signatory to the Rome Statute, and know that he wasn't going to get arrested. Quite the opposite. You had Hungary, you had Viktor Orban receive him at Buda Castle with the full imperial reception, cavalry on horses, ridden by guys with mustaches, these uniforms that look like they were from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You had marching troops. You had the military band play Hatikva in the castle. We really pulled out all the stops. He had this fancy state dinner. It was an easy slam dunk trip for Netanyahu, and they also got kind of the icing on the cake, which was this call between Orban Netanyahu on the one hand in Hungary and Trump on the other hand. Now, that call actually led to this trip to Washington. They talked briefly about the tariffs that Trump had imposed, the 17% tariffs that he had imposed on Israel. And that's something that could be very problematic. And Trump said, why don't you come here and talk about it? Netanyahu seemed reportedly wanted to come maybe during Chol Hamoed of Pesach, maybe afterward. But Trump insisted that he come this week. And why did he want to come? Why did he want Netanyahu to come? Well, when we think about what happened in that meeting in the Oval Office, I think it wasn't only about the tariffs, because in that meeting, Trump surprised the Israelis by saying that he had been having direct talks with Iran. Now, that's something that Iran has denied, but that on Saturday there would be high-level talks about the Iranian nuclear program in Oman between high-level officials on both sides. And that's certainly something that Israel is not thrilled about. Also on tariffs, Netanyahu didn't actually come away with a win from that meeting because in response to a question, Trump refused to commit to getting rid of the tariffs. He said, we'll see. And then he kind of turned the screws on Netanyahu a bit. He said, well, Israel actually gets a ton from the United States, gets $4 billion. That's pretty good. He gave kind of this fake congratulation to Netanyahu. It was a tough meeting for Netanyahu to navigate. And also on Turkey, right? So Turkey is one of Israel's real enemies in the region. They still have diplomatic relations. Officially, they don't have ambassadors in the country, but there is rising tension in Syria between the two countries. Turkey seems to want to build military bases. Israel has been attacking bases before they get there to try to send a message. But Trump had plenty of praise, effusive praise, I would say, for Erdogan, who is someone who doesn't speak English. I don't know how they were able to develop that rapport over the years. He's someone that supports Hamas, that during Eid al-Fitr kind of came out of a mosque and seemed to be asking God to destroy Israel. But Trump, next to Netanyahu, said he's wonderful. He's a very smart guy. Praised Erdogan for taking over Syria. It was bizarre. So on those three top issues, it looks like Netanyahu was not successful. And the question we have to ask ourselves: why was Trump so adamant that Netanyahu come now? There wasn't any major development in the hostage talks, and so what did Trump want to get out of it? It seems like he wanted to talk to him about the Iran talks, maybe update him. But, again, it seemed like the Israelis were taken by surprise by several of his statements. And this was certainly not like the meeting that took place in February, where it was all positive. So we're starting to see areas where there could be significant tension between the two sides. I don't think it's going to get anywhere near the tensions that we saw under the Biden administration. But if Netanyahu thought that, imitating Trump's verbal style and praising him in tweets was going to do it, well, it looks like Trump isn't easily charmed or easily manipulatable. He knows what he wants. He'll go ahead and do it, and he'll even put close allies like Israel, like Netanyahu, in very uncomfortable positions to do so.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. When we're back, we'll talk about some of the other aspects of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's trip to D.C., what was said about the 59 remaining hostages in Gaza, and more about President Trump mediating possibly between Turkey and Israel regarding Syria. Stay with us. So, Laser, it seems that the hostages, the 59 remaining hostages in Gaza, are much lower on Trump's mind and on the Prime Minister and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's mind as well, perhaps as a result. What are your thoughts about that after being in Washington for the last hours?
Well, you're right that it was not the leading issue of this meeting, and it wasn't, the thing that Trump really wanted to talk about. Though when he got going during questions, he spoke at length about meeting the hostages, about what condition they were in, about how it reminded him of Holocaust survivors, of concentration camp survivors. So, it's not like he doesn't still have this passion for getting the a passion for getting the hostages out. But yeah, there was other things that were really dominating the conversation. The tariffs, of course, is something that he is dealing with, that leaders are calling him about, that journalists are asking him about, especially the American journalists. So that is certainly at the top of his mind. And of course, opening up new talks on an Iran nuclear program. In addition to the attempts to stop the Ukraine war, there's a lot going on. There's a lot on his plate. So I think it's natural that you see that the issue is not leading headlines in America and is not dominating the agenda in the White House. Netanyahu, he has to somewhat respond to his host, but he did at some point in his prepared remarks mention the hostages as he always does, and talks about how they're doing everything to get them out, and that the partnership between the two will, he believes, add to the pressure on Hamas that will force them to accept that deal. So yeah, I think that's accurate, but it doesn't necessarily affect anything on the ground as long as the ones whose job it is to pressure Hamas and make sure that that nothing stalls here, they're still doing their jobs.
And there are headlines about Trump mediating between Turkey and Israel on Syria. Can you tell us more about that?
Listen, both Turkey and Israel have said that they don't want to get into any sort of kinetic conflict, any sort of shooting match in Syria. I think it doesn't serve anyone's interests. These are two powerful militaries. They are generally on the same side of the equation in the world, not necessarily in the Middle East, but Turkey's in NATO. It's a close American ally and somewhat indispensable. Same with Israel. So there's really no need to get to a point where there's a fight in the Middle East. But there's a problem that who's going to mediate between the two, since the security services of the two talk, but not the political and the diplomatic level. So if Trump can do that, that's actually quite a service. But it's a little bit worrying that he's so all in on Erdogan, who is someone that says the worst things about Israel, that almost calls for Israel's destruction, kind of like Ahmadinejad style from Iran, and who is a backer of Hamas and doesn't see Hamas as a terrorist organization. So, ultimately our interests are that there's not a fight in Syria, but I don't like the fact, I think Israel should be uncomfortable with the fact that Trump, for some reason, is so won over by Erdogan.
Thanks for all the updates, Laser. Appreciate it. And thanks to you for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Stay tuned for tomorrow's installment. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. Any comments you have about this or other episodes, feel free to drop us an email at podcast@timesofisrael.com. And of course, you can always feel free to recommend us to other listeners and rate us wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, take care and be well.